Hi, and welcome to Ethnographic Imagination Basel, a series on reimagining the world from the mundane. My name is George Palmeyu, and in this episode, we will talk about love, affective attachments, and emotional entanglements as studied by anthropologists. Our guest is Serena Owusua Dankwa, whose scholarly work tackles love in relation to gender, sexuality, friendship, and kinship in Africa and Europe. So stay with us for a conversation on how thinking love against and beyond dominant representations might help us understand our attachments differently. Serena Owusua Dankwa is Senior Lecturer of Social Anthropology at the University of Basel. Her research and writing focus on questions related to gender, sexuality, intimacy in West Africa and Europe. What is particularly distinct about Serena's work is the skill and imagination with which she thinks through concrete experience, the rich stuff of ethnography, to ask key questions pertaining to African feminism and queer anthropology. Serena's degrees come from the University of Bern, a PhD in anthropology, and SOAS in London, an MA in African studies. Her work has spun from long-term ethnographic work with women who love other women in southern Ghana to more recently questions of subjectivity and experience in contexts of feminist humanitarianism, especially as they focus on gender-based violence or sex trafficking in Switzerland, Mali, and Bosnia. I should also mention that Serena has worked herself in the world of NGOs in various projects related to gender and race, and that on top of this, previously, she has also worked at different times in music, radio, and television. Today, our conversation will focus on Serena's book, Knowing Women, Same-Sex Intimacy, Gender and Identity in Post-colonial Ghana, published by Cambridge University Press in 2021, a book that has received the prestigious Ruth Benedict Award and the Elliott Skinner Award from the American Anthropological Association. Serena, it is a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for inviting me.
I was thinking where to start with the topic of love, and I thought maybe I should just ask, what is love? If that's not too quirky, but wondered if that doesn't perhaps take us into some sort of philosophical conversations. So maybe I'll try something else, especially in a context in which particular representations of love have come to be globalized. Love as romantic relationships between two, a monogamous romance. Love as somehow non-commercial, as the kind of stuff you don't mix money with. But also somehow ironically about consumerism, Valentine's Day, and all of that stuff. Is an anthropologist to have anything else to say about love? Is there something we miss about love? And what might an anthropological perspective on love show us that is not quite represented in this domain?
So actually, even if the question was just what is love, I'm not a philosopher. I would answer it very much from what I find interesting about the term. So basically, because it's so popular and it circulates everywhere, it's interesting for anthropologists because it's an everyday concept on the one hand, but it's also a concept in religion. It's something that brings us to more transcendental forms of love. But so for me, if it's a plain question, I would just say it's a feeling. It's not necessarily affect. It's already channeled, it's already considered to be a certain feeling, and it's very much framed by what you just said, romance, and the whole industry that has been built around it, dating apps, romantic wedding ceremonies, etc. But it's definitely something that speaks to a yearning or a longing that is beyond or somewhere beneath the channeled form of what then comes to be seen as love and can be commercialized, consumer capitalist notions of love as Eva Illouz described it, for instance.
In your own work, and I'm thinking here now of knowing women, how did you come upon love? Well, first of all, what did you set off to do in this project? And how did you come to be confronted with the sentiment of love as somehow important?
Mm-hmm. I was very suspicious of love in the beginning, especially because of all these North Atlantic notions of love, or this idealization of love as being the epitome of a fulfilled life, also very much tied to couple love and to nuclear family, or it's supposed to move on to conjugality, companionate marriage and family. So I wasn't using the term love much when I came to Ghana and started looking for women who desire women or women who love women. But at some point, I was more interested in the term desire as a way of saying, even if you're not engaged in a love relationship or a relationship that is considered to be a love relationship, for instance, the women themselves who I ended up working with would not necessarily use the term love as much. They would more use the term friendship. So I tried to really focus on the concepts they used. However, I did realize, or at some point I did come back to love in some ways, because I found it interesting how they framed it when I asked, like, so what is the meaning of love? And I realized that often friendship was more associated with passion, with mepewu, I want you. So almost the desire is almost more with the friendship than with love that comes with these notions of marriage that is not available to same-sex couples in the first place, but that is also in a more Ghanaian or Akan cultural universe. The passion is, marriage is more tied to family, to economy, to procreation, whereas the passion part is more about lovership. There's also a term in Chui, mpenache. So I found it interesting how, or it kind of made me rethink that kind of connection between love and something that is official, that takes a specific form. And so it became more of a floating term to me. But I'm digressing from your question. So I thought of intimacy and what kind of intimacies do I encounter? But first of all, how did I come upon the topic? I mean, if I had believed my father's in the diaspora, if I had believed my anthropology professor, etc., I wouldn't have even tried to look at this subject.
Why?
Because at the time in the early 2000s, there was not much of a consciousness that same-sex intimacy could also be relevant in non-Western contexts.
I see.
So that was my first question. I was like, well, if the erotic and desire is something universal, then it goes all directions everywhere. It's not tied to the heteronormative form. So that was the first challenge, that I didn't want to impose the terms I had learned here and the ideas of a sexual identity. So how to find people, how to find women who are willing to talk about their intimacies, including same-sex intimacies, without me making it the epitome or the central matter. So I was trying to look sideways. I like having the focus on, yes, that is what I'm looking for, but I don't want to define it, whether it's a sort of friendship, whether it's about the erotic.
So the looking sideways, that's a great way of putting it. So looking sideways from what one would expect and listening to the women. So if we're talking about, or you're actually talking about women desiring or women loving other women, you're also resisting any kind of easy translation of their personhood or subjectivity in some sort of sexual identity that everyone would recognize. And on the other hand, by doing that, you also seem to open up the possibility of just how much more and how much more complex could be in a particular set of relationships.
Yeah, and when I whenever I was more explicit and not as sideways, but trying to head on, this is what I'm interested in, or using the terms like lesbian, etc., I would end up in places that were not related really to what I was interested in. Then people would send me to sex workers who have in the past also had female clients from Europe, for instance. And I'm like, no, I'm interested in everyday life. I'm interested in how women live their friendships. And some of those friendships may include, or that was just my assumption, may include erotic intimacies. So yeah, it was very much a work of going beyond the terms, also learning new terms, learning how nonverbal communication is a way of getting to, or looking at gestures of affection. So it did imply, I had to imply myself very much into the research and be attentive on all levels.
This is so interesting, the non-verbal, because in a way, and you show this quite beautifully in the book with different anecdotes with your own interlocutors. The moment you sometimes try to force something into speech, I don't want to say you kill it, but it evaporates, or you get confronted with an interlocutor shutting down because you almost transgress something. You're not supposed to ask.
Yeah.
Or to describe things in language that are otherwise very palpable and real in a non-verbal mode of communication.
Yeah, and I called that indirection or discretion, how you talk about things without necessarily naming them and therefore making them even more valuable. So that there is a lot of... I was never sure whether I should call it secrecy, whether it's that conscious. And it's different. For some women, they did tell me, this is secret. We don't talk about this or don't write about this. And then I asked, okay, but could I write about that? And so there was a whole negotiation. How speakable is this? Because you have to imagine the women I did research with, most of them have lived quite precarious lives, working class or without a job. And they call it hustling. They're really struggling to make ends meet. And this pleasure of having a loved one, having an affair, having someone who is outside marriage, outside all the things you have to do in order to get by, was something really, really precious and particular that did not want to be pinned down in the way that we often do in research.
And I imagine also that, this was already happening at the time you were researching this book, the kind of state-sponsored homophobia, panics, moral panics over same-sex intimacies and so on. It probably intensified since then.
Yeah.
But I wonder also in relation to this sort of panics, the so-called secrecy, if secrecy, as you say, is the right word, is also a strategy to protect something that is otherwise very fragile, very vulnerable forms of attachment and relationality, that otherwise, if they become legible in certain ways, can stand to dissolve.
Definitely, that's one thing of it. And some women even went to the point where they blamed the names that, for instance, gay activists have made this more public, that is the reason why it's become problematic. So they really had this feeling that it's not something that is necessary to be outed. But there are also younger women who do look to countries, places to the West where they feel like, okay, there it's possible to have an open life, and it's interesting and it fascinates them. But it was really both. It was also this thing like, for instance, when I asked, would same-sex marriage, would that be something that you would like to pursue? They were the answers were quite ambivalent. It wasn't like, yeah, of course, that would be great, because they didn't associate it with the lives they had while also having same-sex lovers, the family lives, the compounds, the collectivities, where they felt, or some of them felt, they could have their relationships and it did not interfere with the other sphere. So why make this public? And also, why make it, if marriage is not the big romantic dream, then it's maybe more desirable to keep it at as a friendship at the side, and marriage is tied to all of that which you have to do to get by.
So this, in a way, also translated in the interventions that you're making in the book, and the relation between something like love and sexuality on the other hand, suddenly becomes a problematic one, especially when love is too easily sexualized with these registers of whether sexual rights activism or other similar things. And in the book, you try to decenter assumptions about sexuality or sexual identity to make room for these more expansive ways of what you say, knowing, or knowing as relating in a way. How does love figure in relation to sexuality in that way? I think probably you already answered a bit of this, but...
Well, sexuality, as we understand it here, is our sexual identity, sexual orientation is very much thought of in terms of lesbianism or a certain culture, a certain way of being, of dressing, etc. And that was one thing which I wanted to decenter. And therefore, even sexuality as itself, that we consider it as something separate from other domains of life, I think that's part of the reason why there has been so little research. Because if the women themselves do not necessarily consider it sexual, or they don't call it that, even if in a more intimate discourse, they do talk about practices and including sexual practices. But I thought that is really one of the reasons that it becomes shrouded in silence. And love, on the other hand, what was interesting is that when I asked, so what is love? It was often not tied. The sexual could be a way to get into love, but for instance, relationships that have ceased to be sexual, that were more like sisterhoods, or that they would call we are like siblings. There, the love was usually more situated there, where the heat of passion has kind of gone into something that is more caring and that gives you the kindness to support another person regardless of what comes back. So it's not in that exchange mode anymore. I give you such, right. I like sexually, erotically, and you give me something else, or this constant sussing out of each other. And it became more, something larger, or also in their own definition. When they started philosophizing about love, it was really more a type of solidarity, of an opening to something that is not so much tied to our human fights and passions and what do I want, what do you want.
And yet in the book, you're also showing that one shouldn't confuse sexuality with the erotic. And what you call passion, I mean, the possibility of these friendships always carry the possibility of passion and erotic affordance that is not necessarily to be reduced to the sexual, the way we know it.
Yeah.
I wonder if you want to say a bit something about, friendships more generally, but more specifically, a term that itself perhaps has become controversial in Ghana. That's the term of the supi. And what the difference is between how these women you worked with imagine supi versus how it's being featured in public debate.
So supi is probably derived from superior. It's probably, it may have an English connection, but there's also another etymological possibility that it comes from a term that is used in Asafo companies. These are young men's secret societies, where they have a particular pot that holds, I think it holds water. It's like a shell, and supi
with a ritual significance.
It has a ritual significance, and the person who is in charge of it is considered the supi, and it's like the mother of this object. So, because the term supi is very popular on the coast, where the first boarding schools were established, and it's also very much associated with boarding school intimacies between girls. But that's also the region where those Asafo companies were active. So I'm just speculating whether there is a connection, whether it's something else than superior. But supi has also been used in Nigeria, for instance. So there is, if there is this English, this Anglophone root to it, then probably it has traveled through boarding schools, because it's kind of it translates well. Basically, it means a friendship that is a girl friendship between two young women with a slight age difference. If you want to translate it into kinship terms, it could be a slightly older and a slightly younger sister supporting each other. And exchange is very important. Or when I asked women about whether they've had a supi, they would often talk about, you propose friendship to someone by, for instance, giving them some present. And then you think about, what am I going to give back? And that's how they engage in an exchange relationship then that can become more and more intense and can go into the erotic.
And is the asymmetry here between and the older partner and the younger partner also shaping who is supposed to initiate the gift exchange?
Well, usually it's the senior who is initiating the exchange. And then it's framed as a learning process of how do you figure out what the other person likes about you or wants from you, and how do you create also an erotically charged atmosphere to even bring up the desire in the other person that this could be more than just a regular friendship. So there's all these stories around how you find out, but then you don't really know. It's also a bit uncanny. You're kind of, it's not just positive. There can also be like, oh, then I didn't know where she takes me, or why did she make me drink this drink?
So speculation on the meaning of the gift. Why am I receiving what I'm receiving?
Exactly.
This what is also interesting here. I think that a lot of the assumptions or the kind of dominant assumptions about love in the world, in the market, what have you, presuppose it as somehow being separate from exchange, separate from material reciprocity, and so on. Whereas what we see with the soup, in a way, is the centrality of the circulating of the material with passion, with affect, and
I think that's really one of the privileged notions or the norms, that love is somehow beyond the material. If you don't rely on other people in your everyday life, maybe you can even come up with that idea. But I felt in Ghana that wasn't even an option, because if you're struggling, of course the person who loves you doesn't want you to go hungry in the evening. Of course they would buy some food for you, or they would support your kids if they're hungry. So I found that was a very natural part of caring for each other. Love was is about care. And that is sometimes forgotten when we have more of these ideas of love letters and flowers and instrumental ways. However, even in Switzerland, love is not free from economic considerations. You have all these marriages between rich people. Why don't they marry someone who's not rich, for instance?
It's the gap there between the rhetoric of pure, quote unquote, pure love versus the actuality where there is no love that is not entangled in the material.
And I'm not saying there's no romance. I mean, it's for instance, the term romancing. I romanced her. That could be something very simple, that you would wash your lover's hands before sharing a meal from the same bowl. Or one woman always insisted, I even wash her underwear. I mean, what other better sign is there for real or pure love? Or spoon feeding each other. Also gestures of motherliness. That would translate, or that would be considered as love. But at the same time, I think it's also when we think about sex work and transactional sex, it's always, for a lot of people, it's a problem. The actual problem is that there is the transaction involved. And that, I think, is an illusion that it's beyond those more instrumental.
It's probably a fantasy that we like to to have. But going back to also the motherhood issue, I remember from my own field in Kenya, a mother in her 50s who, whenever I would go visit her, would show me her latest face cream, her latest DVD or radio, and always point out how her children down country have been working and sending her these things. And this is, look how much they love their mother. So in a way, the material becomes also a token, it seems, of love. How about sugar motherhood, which seems to play out in relation to the SUPI and to women who desire women, and also to what you talked about this kind of difference of status, generation, age, that also seems to be important.
So unlike SUPI, where even if there is a slight age difference, a seniority, it's imagined as a sisterly bond, as a mutual bond, that it becomes more and more mutual. Whereas with sugar motherhood, or if someone says, this is my sugar mother, there is a bigger age gap and bigger gap in seniority or in material wealth, for instance. And it's more clearly said that one person supports the other or sponsors the other. I met a lot of young football players who had older women who worked in the market. And there I was always unsure to what extent. I mean, there are love stories that I can hear as love stories, but then there are also stories where the younger person, for instance, says, I work for love, in a way of diminishing or reducing their own powerlessness, maybe within the relationship, because you live at that person's house. She gives you money for you. So there is a dependency there that can be problematic and that can be abusive. So that's the problematic part of it. On the other hand, the older woman, who is often burdened with a lot of responsibilities, it brings some sugar to her life as well to have a younger lover. So I don't think that the hierarchies per se make it not love.
Exactly, where I was trying to get at, I think. So it's not the hierarchy that it's the same like with the money or the material exchange. Right? It's the presence as an annal.
And there has to be more attentiveness, of course. And I think from both sides to those differences, because the illusion that you are the same, that you are sisters, I mean, that's the thing with same-sex love, is not so available. And then besides transgressing the boundary that you're of the same gender, you're also having this age gap, which can also help to make it more structured, a relationship. Like that's one issue, that lesbian relationships then... If you think of yourself as the same, it can become boring, or it can become, butch femme theories also talk about this, how this gender difference is often connoted negatively, but it can also bring some pleasurable tension into relationships. And here it's more the age gap, and there are all those theories of old-time anthropologists about age-based homosexualities and gender-based homosexualities, where they looked at it as an institution and they said, okay, here we have the model where difference is constructed through gender, and here difference is constructed through age. For Africa, the gender-based model was seen, but I could also see a lot of age. I mean, these whole models are problematic because then at the end of the day, Europe has the egalitarian model. Yeah. So that's very suspicious. And I could see a lot of reciprocities, but there is also violence and there is also hierarchies that we shouldn't overlook. But I think it doesn't mean that there is no love in that. I think we can learn a lot through differences as well.
Yeah. I think a lot of what you're telling us here makes me also think of how do we recognize as love things that don't necessarily are immediately legible or describable or even put in words as such as love, and how do we stay attuned to that? So it's perhaps a methodological but also a life question. But let me perhaps ask that question in relation to your current work. So you're working now... You're researching interventions around sex trafficking, around gender-based violence, both institutions and their efforts, and from the outside, that might not be necessarily one of the places where you could look for love or expect love, although humanitarians do imagine their work as a labor of love or a work of love. But the question, I think, is more, how do you stay attuned as a researcher, even as you move in this other projects that deal with some harsh realities, to questions of love and to the kind of love that is not necessarily immediately legible as such.
So if I may make the link to the sugar motherhood, what is interesting there is that the money that, for instance, a younger person gets does not necessarily stay with that younger person, but is also given to other people and to other lovers or friends, and thereby creating networks where love becomes collectivized, where it's not so much about just the two people, but everybody is aware we're part of a network, and all the negotiations also tie us together. There's also often a mediator, etc. And with trafficking, I've realized that the persons themselves who are trafficked, they are, in order to get out of it, they are often asked to sever all ties to the past, or that's what it effectively runs down to, because often the person who exploited them is somehow connected to their families, to the place where they come from. So there is this alienation. And what makes it hard to sever those ties is often love. For instance, there's a lot of trafficked women who have children, actually. The majority are mothers, and they cannot give up, even if the exploitation only leaves a little money to them, the little they can send to their kids or their own mothers, the care obligations is really making them vulnerable. So speaking to people, also to counselors in this field, they're telling me that that actually love becomes like a liability, that and especially for mothers. And then there's another aspect when people come to a safe house, for instance, which is usually a place where they're just women or female-read persons. And I mean, coming with my lens on queerness, I'm also asking myself, okay, what happens among people who are then put together based on their victim status and their vulnerability? How do they see each other? What matters within those relationships that are usually not considered to be anywhere close to love? And there are a lot of fights. There is a lot of tension there. But if we understand love as a form of solidarity, I also wonder how that would play out, both among people who are considered to be victims, but also among those who are providing care and trying to support. What does it do to them that they are sometimes seen as mothers or as white mothers, so the victims often being racialized? So I think I will definitely try to queer these categories that are used, for instance, in the field of trafficking, to get more beyond the surface or besides what these categories are supposed to stand for.
Categories. Serena, between thinking of love as legibility or liability, between thinking of it through material forms of expression, passion, and complicated entanglements that it places, when you gave us an amazing kind of way to think beyond and aside dominant categories. And for that, we thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I didn't expect to become the love prophet, but it was nice talking to you.
Likewise.
Thank you.